Hey, thanks for stopping by my channel. In this video, we're going to be setting up our database and our server for our portfolio resume build that we started in the previous video. This is going to be the most valuable portion of this resume slash portfolio website build because here you're actually going to see how a server is set up, how we can link a database, how we can make it secure, and then we're going to also make it vulnerable to SQL injection. We're going to be setting up an API. So if you want to be a bug bounty hunter or an ethical hacker, either way, this is going to be really valuable for you because you're going to actually be able to understand what is going on the server side, how servers are linked to databases, and how exactly APIs work and calls and post requests can be made. Also in this video, you're going to get to see me make a few mistakes and have to debug my code. This I think will also be pretty valuable. I left a lot of my debugging in there so you can see exactly what I do. Even if you're not going to be building any web application or portfolio because you want to be a bug bounty hunter, it can still be helpful to learn how to debug your code because you might come across some exploit on the internet in the future and need to be able to debug it in order to get it to work. So I think there will be a lot of useful information in there for you, whether you are going to be trying to become an ethical hacker and you're building out a resume, or you are a bug bounty hunter and you just want to understand how servers and databases and APIs and websites in general on a really small scale work in general. So about halfway through making this video, I realized that there is a lot of code in here that might be new for you if maybe you've only ever studied Python and you haven't done any type of web development, and you might feel overwhelmed at times, but you have to remember in building a resume where you don't have any college work experience or certifications, that you are trying to bypass years of study. And so as you come into this portfolio build, just know that as you run into concepts in this video that you don't understand, you may need to go to Google and read some documentation to try and understand what is happening. And it might be overwhelming for you if you don't have a background in web development, but it is something that you're going to need to understand and it is going to look really good on a resume. So I do recommend going through this portfolio build, setting up the database and the server along with the API, so that you really understand what is going on, especially if you don't have any of those previously mentioned credentials. And if the feeling of being overwhelmed doesn't leave you right away, you can just pause the video and come back later or another day. But I would suggest continuing through, even if it is hard for you to understand, because you will need to understand this information. And if you're going to be applying to get a job anywhere and you are lacking the standard credentials, this will be something that will help stand out to say you have the ability to push through, understand code. So if you become overwhelmed throughout this video, that is something that might be expected. Just take a break, maybe go out to Hack the Box and spend some time on a Hack the Box machine or on Portswigger doing some of their labs. Just take a break and continue growing as an ethical hacker, and then come back to this portfolio and continue working on your resume and building up valuable skills that will help you land a job in the future. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. Okay, so if you followed along with the last video, then this is where we have left off. We built a little nav bar and we added in this little GitHub button and we added in a footer right here, just like this. So this is where we are, and maybe you've gone ahead and continued working on yours. And if you remember, the way we open this up is we open up our folder over here that we have saved, and we open up our index.html, which we saved inside here, and that will open up our web page for us so we can see what it looks like. And we'll have this path right here as our URL that brings us to our index.html. But now we're going to work on setting up the server, and it's going to send this file to our browser. So let's go ahead and come back over to our text editor. Actually, before we do that, I need you to come out to Google and go to this link right here. I'll have it down in the description, and you need to install nodeJS. So you can just click this one right here that says recommended for most users. And after you click on the link in the description, it should automatically detect what you're running. Is it going to be Mac or Windows? And if you need the ARM64 version, if you're running a Mac with the M1 chip, and it should automatically recognize it. You'll click this download and go ahead and install it. Then we'll come back over to our project over here, and we need to create a few more files, and then we'll go ahead and set up our server. So the first thing we can do is we can just come over here. Actually, we'll do this from the terminal. We'll just go ahead and tell it we want to touch, and we want to create a server server.js. And we also will want to cd into the views, and we want to create a SQL.html. That's going to be our HTML site. And then actually we can come back, and over here we can create a db.js, and this should give us these files over here. And now that you've installed nodeJS, we can come over here and say npm, and we've installed npm in the last video. We'll say npm, if I can type, install express, just like this. And this will give us another package.json over here. And this one's going to be really quite gigantic, but it's going to have for us the express packages that we need in order to create our server. So now that we have express installed, we'll also need to install MySQL, and then we'll go ahead and create our server. So you can type in npm install, and we're going to use MySQL 2. And we'll just hit enter, and that should go ahead and install. I actually already have it installed. Okay, apparently I'm going to go ahead and install it a second time. So now we can come over to our server.js, and we're just going to do something really simple. Like we're going to say const express equals require, and I actually believe this way is deprecated, but this is how I learned, and this is how I'm going to write the code. Express, and then we want to set a variable for express, so we'll just say const app equals express, and then we're going to call express, and we can call a port, so we can say const port equals, and you can put in 9001 if you like IPsec, or you can just add in the typical 3000 that you'll see a lot of programmers use when they're setting up their ports. And now we want to send something. This is actually going to make our server do something. And so just to be clear, these const right here, if you've watched my JavaScript video, you'll see me use var a lot, just like this. And const is really going to do the same thing, only var can be changed within functions and const cannot. And other programming videos that you watch on the internet, you might see let, which is going to be the same as var. But for now, we're just going to use const, and you'll probably see me use var, especially when we're working with the API, just because it is an old habit and that's how I learned. So I use var quite a bit, but for now we're just going to use const, just so you know what this is and what's going on. So we're just saying every time we call express, it's going to do this. Every time we use the word port, it's going to know that we're using 3000. So now let's make our server actually do something, and we can say app, which if you remember, this is going to be express. It's going to be handling our JavaScript, which is what nodeJS is. It's just a server-side JavaScript. So we're going to say app.get, and then we want it to get this root folder right here. This is going to be our root right here. And so now that it's starting at our root, what do we want it to do? We want to request. So you're going to see request and response, just like this, only with a lowercase r, response, just like this. But I like to use request, rec, and res, and this is going to be really typical. Anytime you're looking at server-side Node.js, you're going to see rec and res, but just saying this is the request and this is the response. So now that we have this rec and res, what do we want to do with it? We're going to call another function, and we're going to tell it, we want it res.send, and we're going to tell it to send something to our browser. And we can say hello hackers, and we can close all of this off just like this. And I'm going to forget a lot of those semicolons, but it is common code to close all of this off. So now let's tell our server to turn on and to work and to make sure it's working. So we can just say app.listen, and we're going to have it listen on our const up here that we have, port 3000. At least that is what I'm using. And we're going to call a function, and inside here, we're going to tell it to console.log. And we want it to send a message that our server is working, just like this. And we need to call our function like this. So we can save that. And now if we come down to our terminal, we can say npm start, and we want to start our server.js. And it tells us that we have an error. It is because I spelled express wrong. So now let's give this another try. And it tells us our server is working. So now if we come back over to our web page, we should be able to come over here and type in localhost 3000, and it tells us hello hackers. So now we know our server is working, and it's actually sending our request to the browser. And before we go too far, I just want to show you that we can throw that in the trash and we can type in nodemon start server.js. And nodemon is really nice because every time we want to restart our application, we can just hit command save. So if I didn't show you how to start nodemon in the last video, you can just open up a new terminal. You will type in npm install-g nodemon and hit enter, and that should install nodemon globally on your local machine. And you should be able to use nodemon just like this over here, so that way we can restart our server just by hitting command save. This is going to be really helpful when we are setting up our API and our database, because we are going to crash our server quite a lot. So I'll go ahead and trash that terminal. And if you're having trouble with nodemon, you can always use npm. You just have to restart it every single time that you crash your server. So instead of sending this hello hackers right here, this isn't really helpful for us. What we want to send is our index.html. So just like we do with our CSS, we come over here and we should be able to say /views, remembering that we're starting in our root directory. And now we can say index.html like this. And if we save this, we should be able to send this over. So we'll type in nodemon start server.js, and that should start for us. And now if we refresh this, it did not work for us. And that is because we need to tell it we want to send a file like this. And it is possible that we're going to have to add in the path just in case this doesn't work. And it says that's an error. So now we need to add in our path. I got a little bit ahead of myself. So we'll just say const path equals require, and we want to require path just like this. And we'll come back up under here and we'll just add in app.use express.static, and this is going to send our path for us every single time we need it to. So we'll say path.join, and we're going to say __ dir name and the static just like this. And this is going to send from, we use this dir name right here because it's going to send everything that is relative to our project that we have saved right here, rather than every single thing on a system. Because when you host up websites and you're running a server, you're often running them on somebody else's server, and there's going to be a ton of files. And this dir name tells it we want to run it from our specific files that we upload. So this is going to be important to use, and we're just sending it all of our static files. And we're going to want to send it everything in our public folder. So we can actually just say app.use express.static, and then we're going to tell it to send the public, everything inside of our public file. So we'll say public just like this. And I accidentally deleted one of our parentheses, so we'll go ahead and throw that in, and our semicolon, because that is good practice. So that should give us our static files. And in here, just to make sure that we send this the right way, we're actually going to add in the __ dir name and a comma just like this, and that will send it from relative to our file. Instead of this comma, we actually need to add our file in like this and refresh, and now you should have something that looks like this. And the reason it looks like this is because our server is now sending this index.html right here, which causes us to have a problem with our CSS. Remember, we just told it to send all of our static files starting from the root directory. So in order to get our CSS and our images to pop up over here on our site, we're going to have to come over and move the relative path for all of these. So if we come over to our CSS, instead of sending this from our index.html, we had to go back one file to get back to public, and then into the CSS, and then the styles.css. But because we are sending everything static from our root path right here, what we need to do is just delete this public, because we're currently starting in everything that's included inside this resume files. So we can just delete, because we're sending the public folder. Now, if we save that and refresh, we get our color. I was confused there for a second. I forgot that we called our public folder over here, so we didn't need to try and go back into our public folder. And you're gonna have to do the exact same thing with every single one of these images in order to get the images to render. So we can come down to our images and we can just delete the public off of it. And if we save this and come over here and refresh it, we now have our images start popping up. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these, and instead of making you watch me do this, you can go and do this on your own, and I'll see you once you finish doing this. I have finished deleting all of the publics off of here, and now we have the correct path to get to our source photos. And if we save it and you refresh it, we now have our page back, and it is being sent from our local host server. So now we have our server working, and it is sending our index.html along with our CSS and images properly. So we'll come back over to our server, and now we're going to create a login page, and then we'll set up our database. This login page is going to be very simple. We're not going to dress it up. We just want to link it to a database so that we can create some SQL injection on our server and our database. So we're just going to come underneath of this right here, and we're going to send another file. And just in case you didn't know, this right here is actually just calling a function. So we can delete this and add in a function over here. If you're not, just in case you're not used to seeing a function written like that, this is how you're going to see functions written in the wild. Just in case you come across it, there should be a space there. You'll see functions written like this. I like to write them like this because it's easier to understand what's going on, especially if you're new. So when you see this right here, just know this is the same thing as a function. So that was a little side note. We want to have our app send another file, and we're going to just copy all of this and paste. That is bad practice if you're a programmer, because if I had a bug in here and I copied and pasted, I now have the same bug 2 times. But we do not, and I'm certain of it. So we're going to just delete this, and we're going to say we want to send our login page. So we'll just say login. Actually, just to make this a little more clear, we'll just call this our SQL.html, and we're going to make another static HTML file. So we can actually come back over here, split our terminal, we'll cd into views, and we're going to touch SQL.html. And we now have this file over here, and we can type in HTML, and we want this 5 boilerplate, just like we did before. We can delete this title because we don't want that, and we can save this. So now we have our HTML, and just in case we want to see if it works, you can add in an H1 if you want. I'm just going to type in it works because I don't actually care about the styling just yet, and this looks like it should work. So let's go over here and refresh, and we'll slash, we want to go into SQL.html, and it tells us that it can't get the file. Let's come back over here and see what the deal is. And it is because we want to send from here our views/sql.html. And now it works. And if we refresh this, we can see that it works. It's now sending our sql.html. And we're just going to make a really simple form. I want to keep this as basic as possible. So now that we see that our file's being sent, we're going to create a form and have it be sent to we'll have it be sent to the client side of our project. So just very basically, we're going to just type in form, and we're going to close this off, and we're going to tell it we want to have an action over here, and our action, you can call this whatever you want. We're actually just going to call it an API because that's kind of what it is. And so we're just going to say API, and we want a method of post. So we're sending a post request. Then we are going to we'll just leave this like it is for now. And we're going to call this, we'll say H1, and we'll call it, actually, I don't want to return that. I want that all in one line. We want to call this, let's say we're creating, and actually we'll just say create account, just like this. And so if we save this and we refresh, we have our create account. Now we want some input forms, so we can just say input, and inside here we'll just give it an ID, and we'll say ID1. I like to run everything with IDs, and this is you're gonna see what I'm talking about when we when we call the fetch API and we actually create our API. We'll come back and put IDs in there later. So I'm going to delete this for now, but just know that we're going to be adding in IDs later. So we're going to say this is actually going to be a type of text, and then we want to name it something. So this is going to have the name of user. So this is where our users will input a username when they create a user. So if we save this and come over, we'll now have a box over here, and this is going to be our user box. So now we can copy this, and we want to call this a password. And if we save it, we'll now have a second one over here. And we want to create a button. So we can say button, and we're going to give it a type of submit. And this is going to also be important because we're going to use this later when we call our API. On submit, it's going to call the API and send this information over in the form of JSON to our server. So we can close this off and we can just say submit like this, save it and refresh, and we now have our button. And I clicked it and it doesn't work because we don't have our server set up to receive any information yet. So one thing I want to add is I do not really like this in the far left side. So we'll just say we want to style equals, and we're going to say text align, and we want the text aligned in the center, just like this. So if we save this and refresh it, it's now in the middle, and I think that looks a lot better. I told you we weren't going to style it, so that's all the more styling that we'll do. And if you wanted to, you could actually just come over here. If you don't like the button right there, you can just add in a break and save this, and now our button is on a different line. But I don't like that because now I feel like I need to add padding because this is touching and I don't like that. So I'll just leave it off to the right. So if we refresh it, our button's over here. So we'll leave this create an account, and we'll set up our database now, and then later I'll show you how to check to see once our create account is being sent to the database that it's all working, and then we'll come back and make a login function to check that the user is able to put information in, send it to the server. The server is going to check it against the database and then send back a logged in or a wrong password to the user. So it sounds like a lot, but it's really not all that complicated. So this is all saved, and the next thing I want to do, I think, is we will just send our information back to our server to make sure that it's all working. So now we're gonna set up our API, and we're gonna be using Fetch API. And if you're unfamiliar with Fetch, you can just go out to Google and read about Fetch API. Fetch is really popular, and so is Axios, but Axios is usually used with React, and we're not using React, so we're gonna use Fetch. So the next thing we need to do is add in some JavaScript, and we're going to add in a const for our user. And in order to get something from our input right here, from our actual HTML, we're going to have to say document get, and then so the document is going to get something from the form that is being submitted. So we'll say get element by ID, and I told you earlier that I like to use ID. So we'll come up here and say ID equals, and we want our ID to equal 1. So now if we come over here and we say we want to grab this by the element ID 1, it's going to grab this right here. It's going to get whatever the input is, and then it is going to post it. So now that we have our user being grabbed by the ID right here, we're going to need to do the same exact thing for our password. So we can just add in an ID, and we're just going to call this ID2. We can save it. Copy this, we're going to add in this, we'll say password, and we want to grab element by ID number 2. And now we can add in our event lister. So when our submit button is clicked, we want it to do something. If you're familiar with cross-site scripting and then you'll often see something like on error. Well, in this case, we're going to be doing like an on click or an on submit function, but we're going to add an event listener that is listening to this type right here. So we're just going to say form, which is going to grab the form that we've made, and we're going to say add event listener. And we want this to go on submit. So we'll say submit. And we want to call a function, and we're going to say function, and we're going to pass in a variable, and we're going to pass this over and say e.prevent default. And this is just going to, if there's some kind of error, it's going to prevent the fetch API from running the default function, because we just want it to handle the information that we are putting in rather than the fetch API using its own default methods. I forgot to add back in here our method. We need our method. And I had a typo here in a function I had to fix to get all of this to work. So now we have this right here, and this should have auto completed, but this function was spelled wrong, so that didn't work for us. So now we have this set up. We can actually do something with our data. So we could say console.log, and we can console log the data that is being passed in, and our API is going to pass it through in JSON. So the proper syntax for this is data like this. And now we're actually going to set up the actual API part of our project. So we'll hit enter, and we're actually going to call the fetch API right here. And now we're going to pass over this API right here that we have called. And this needs to be inside quotes in order to have proper syntax. And we're going to open up a set of curly braces, and we want it to do something. So on this method, we want it to post some information, and we're going to send the information. And this needs to also be inside quotes, and the information we want to send is going to be done through JSON. So we're going to say body, and we're going to say JSON.stringify. And if you're not familiar with this, this is something you see a lot inside of JSON. This is something that you see inside of JSON. This is how we're sending the data. So what do we want to send in JSON.stringify? This method right here, we want to send the actual data that we are pulling down that we console logged. So now it's going to send an ID, which is going to be blank, but when it registers in our database, it's going to register the IDs in the order that the users are created. It's going to send over the username, and it's going to send the password, and it's going to send it to our server inside of this JSON right here. So this is the data which is inside our form that is being sent over to our server. And at this point, we need to tell it that we want to do something else. So pretty simply, inside of fetch API, once we grab this information and we've turned it into JSON, we then want it to do something. So we're going to tell it we want our response, and we're going to call the function of res.json, just like this. And then once it has the response of JSON, we want it to then do something with our data, and we want it to console log the data so that way we can actually see it when it gets sent. So we'll call this in our function, and we're going to say we want it to console log the data once again to make sure that it's being sent properly. And then if there is an error, we want it to do something. So if there's an error, we want it to console log that we have an error. So we'll tell it console log and error, just like this. So now that we have this all set up, we are ready to receive it over on our server. So this is what a simple fetch API post looks like, and we're going to be sending it inside of JSON. If you have any questions about fetch API, you can go read about it on Google. The documentation, I assure you, is boring, but you'll probably get a better understanding for how the fetch API works. Okay, so I just noticed we have this error right here. This is not working for us, and there's actually a couple of errors. errors that I am noticing. One, this needs to have a comma right here, and that will get rid of this. But I accidentally added these in a little bit too early. I closed this off, so we can actually just cut this because this all needs to be inside of one function. And now we can close off this original function right here. And that should work for us and get rid of our errors. So now let's jump over to our server over here. So let's receive the API post request and console log our information, and then we'll set up our database. So let's come right in here and we'll set up our post request. So we can say app.post. So instead of a get request, we want a post, and we're going to be receiving it from the API, and we get that from right over here where we named our action. So right here we have the API. It's going to be sending right here API. So we can set this up, and we're going to tell it we want to call a function just like normal, and we want the request and we want the response, and we want to open up a set of curly braces right here, and we just want to console.log our information. We want to console log the request, and we want the body of the request to be console log so that way we can actually see it. And when we see it, we're going to see it inside of the JSON. So after we get done typing in our console log, if we come back over here and refresh our login page and we send this over, we get this undefined right here. And that is because we need to install or call our body parser, and we need it to be able to pass in the JSON. So this actually, it took me a few minutes to figure out what was going on. I couldn't figure it out, and I just realized we forgot to call our body parser. So we can actually come up here and just say const, and we want to call body parser just like this equals, and we're going to say require, and we want it to require for us the body parser. So we'll say body equals parser, and this can be named whatever you want, remembering that it is a variable, but this has to be very specific, written this way. So what we want to do with this right here is we also want to make sure that what we're sending over from our URL is passed through properly through Express. So we want to come in here and say app.use, and we want to use Express like this, and we're going to say URL encoded, and we're going to tell it we want extended and false. And the reason this is got this error right here is because it needs to be inside curly braces. We'll go ahead and save this right here, and this is going to be used for creating a user. So we're going to use this right here for creating our user. Later we're going to rewrite this when we actually are using it for our login function, but for now we can leave this and we'll save it. And now if we come back over to our page and refresh and we add in a user, we'll send this, and our page says that it is hanging. So we'll go ahead and cancel that. But over here, you can see that our information is now being passed through as JSON, and we're not getting that error that we had when we didn't have our JSON being registered on our server. So now this is working, and now we need to be able to do something with this information. So we're receiving a user and a password. Now we need to be able to save it, and here comes the time for us to set up our database. So if you come back over to your internet browser, I am going to have this linked also in the description. I'm going to take you to this page. You're going to click download now, and it will automatically detect your operating system. You're going to tell it what you're using. This is a Mac. If you're using the ARM64, make sure you grab the ARM64 version instead of the x86. You're going to download this, and then you're going to open it. And if you're on a Windows machine, you might have to tell it that it needs to allow you to open things that are downloaded from the browser. If you're on a Mac, you're going to go to your system preferences and then security and privacy, and then you're going to go over to your, I think it's privacy. maybe it's a general. You'll come over to general and you'll have a little button here that says allow you to run apps or something like that from a browser. You will unlock your machine, you will click allow, and now you'll be able to open up your MySQL database. And it will look like this when you're able to open up your workbench, but you're not done yet. You actually need a server to run on your local machine in order to get your workbench to save your databases somewhere on your machine. So what you will need to do is install a MySQL community server. It will automatically register this for you. You can say what you're using. If you're on an ARM64, which is the M1 chip by Apple, or x86, it should automatically register for you. I believe I used this one right here when I downloaded this. And then this right here will open up. If you're on a Mac, the way you'll start this, you'll come back to your system preferences and it'll be down here in the bottom. You can click this and you can start your MySQL server, and you might have to restart your computer, but I don't think you'll have to. I think you'll be able just to tell it you want it to start your server, and it will start running for you your MySQL server, and it'll automatically link to your MySQL workbench right here. So you should probably go ahead and pause the video at this point and download the MySQL server and also the MySQL database, get the server up and running and have your workbench open. Then we're going to go ahead and create our own database and link it to our server over here so that we can start storing this information and we can actually have people log in and create users. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and set up a connection now by telling it we want to hit this connection. What do we want our database name to be? We'll just call it resume, just like this, and we can hit enter and it should pop open for us. When you click this, I forgot to mention that when you create your database, you need to pick a password for your root user, and you'll go ahead and type that in and it will open this up for you. Now we're going to need to create a new database. So we're going to say we want to create a schema and we're going to call it our resume, just like this. We'll say apply, and we have our resume right here. We can close this. So we can pop this down and we have this tables right here, and we want to create a table. And so we're going to call our table, we'll just call it SQL injection, just like this. And we'll say we want to name our column number 1 as ID, and it automatically is going to check these boxes. We're going to want to check this second to last one right here. Then we're going to want to create one called a user, and then we're going to want to create one called password. So we're going to create password, and these are going to be our columns right here. So we now have this set up. We can click apply, and it's going to give us the SQL statement to do or to make our changes. We'll say apply. We can close this. Now inside of our tables, we have this table name right here, and we have our ID, user, and password inside of the columns. So now we can come back over to our code and begin setting this up. So we'll come back underneath our API connection, and this is where we're going to go inside of our post. We want to post that information to our database. So I think what we'll do is we'll write some secure code for creating our user and our password, but then when we actually log in, we'll go ahead and create that with vulnerable code, so that way you can see what the secure code looks like and then the vulnerable code looks like. So before we actually create this, I forgot we need to link our database. So over here we need to create a connection. So we'll just say const MySQL equals, and we want to require, and we already installed this, and if you haven't, you'll need to install it now. And we're going to use MySQL 2, just like this. If you just use MySQL, you're going to get an error, and to fix the error is kind of a pain, so we're just going to run MySQL to just like that, because we don't need to know exactly what's going on in order to get this to work. We just don't want the error, and we want our tables to work. So we'll just say down here that we're going to create a variable. So we can say var, or we can use const. I'm going to use var just because I feel like it. So we'll say we want the database to equal MySQL dot create connection. And right here, this is going to be our connection that we're going to send back over to our server over here. So we're going to open this up, we're going to add our curly braces, and we're going to say our host is the local host. Because we are using our local host, we're going to say our database is going to be, what did we call our database? I don't remember. Our database is called resume. So we'll say resume, just like this. I want to save that, make sure I spelled it right. I have it all spelled the same, because if we have a typo, then it won't work. So now we're going to say user, and we're going to say our user is going to be the root user, and that is the root user we use to log in to our database right here. So when you click this and it said log in, what did you use to log in? I use the root username and then the password that you use to create in order to log in. So I am very secure with all of my information, and this is why sometimes you're going to see when you do dumpster diving on GitHub, if anybody pushes code, you can sometimes grab users off of GitHub and report those on bug bounty programs, because you're going to see that you have to write this code in plain text. So on GitHub, you should hide this if possible, but because this is hosted on my local computer, I don't really care if you see my password. And so my very secure password is password. And so we'll save that, and now our database should be able to go out and log in and connect to our MySQL workbench, and it's going to create the connection. It's going to connect to our local host. It's going to connect to the database that we named resume. It's going to use our user, and it's going to log in. And we want to export this module. So we're going to export as DB, just like this. Now we should be able to grab this over here on our server. So in order to create this connection over here on our server, we're going to come back to the top. We're going to say const, and we're going to use connection. Sometimes I use DB, sometimes I use connection. We're going to create this connection just like this, and we're going to require what we just made over here, this DB right here. So we're going to use connection so that way we don't get confused with our DB over here. So we're going to require this, and it's going to require the entire full path in order to get to this database right here that we created. So we can come over here and right click this, and we're going to say copy path, and we don't want the relative path, we want the full path. So we can come over here, paste that in, and it's going to give the full path to this file right here. So now if we save this, it should link to our database. Now we can check our database to make sure that it is working by coming down here to our port listen. So this is going to check. So we see our server is working. Now we want to see if our connection is working. So we can just say connection.connect and make sure that this is working. And so we're going to open up a set of parentheses because we're calling this connect method, and we're actually going to call a function, and we're going to open up another set of parentheses as well as curly braces, and we're going to first say if there's an error, we want it to throw an error. And now we're going to open up our curly braces, and we're going to say if there is an error, we want it to let us know that there is in fact an error. So we'll say throw the error right here, and then we'll say if this doesn't work, then we want it to console log the database is working. So we'll say console.log database is working. So if we save this and we refresh it, we can see that our database is now working. So our connection is in fact set up. So now that our database is all connected, we can do something with this post request right here and send the information over to our MySQL database. So remembering that we grabbed our username from this body right here, we can actually create variables. You can do this with variables or without variables. I think we're going to go ahead and just do it with variables so you can see what it looks like. And maybe in the next one, we'll do it without them. So we'll say const username. We're going to create a new variable called username, and we're going to use the request, and we're going to say rec.body, just like we did before. And we want specifically the user right here. And then we can come down and say const, and we'll say password equals rec.body.password, just like this. Now, if we print this username and password, if we console logged it, it should specifically grab just the password and just the username. And this is actually user, not username, like this. We're grabbing the user and password from our SQL over here. We want this user and we want this password that are being grabbed by this element and sending over. So we have these guys saved now in variables, and we want to connect it. So we're going to give our connection dot query for this is our database query. So this is why sometimes I like to say this as DB, because it would say db.query, but in this case, we're going to use connection. So this is going to be our actual SQL statement. What do we want to say to our database? And this is when you have to use SQL statements, and we're going to say, hit the caps lock because we are good database query makers, and we're going to say insert into our database, which we named, I don't remember. We named it SQL injection right here. So we'll say inject into SQL underscore injection. We should have named that something a little easier to type so that way we don't have typos, but I think that's right. And what do we want to insert into this table? We want to insert into it our user and the password. So these are going to be the actual columns and that we want to enter into. We want to enter into this column right here, the user and the password, and it's going to automatically supply the ID based on when this is sent. So we want to say password just like this. And this is how you would write a secure SQL statement, the values, and we're passing in two of these variables, which is $1 and $2. And we can close this off right here. So this right here, if somebody adds in a quotation, this is not going to close out or this is not going to break our SQL statement. It would just add your username as a quote because it's being sent in as this variable, which you're going to see the difference here in just a little bit. So we have that SQL statement now being sent over, and we need to register if we have an error. So we're going to give this bracket right here, and we're going to say our username and our password right here. And we're going to see if we have any error. So we'll actually call a function right here. So we're sending over our username and password. We need a comma right here, and we're actually going to call a function. So if there is an error, we want it to send the result of the error. So we'll say if there's an error, we want the result, and we'll call our function. We'll open up our curly braces in order for our function, and if there is an error, we're going to console log the error for us so we can see what it looks like and hopefully debug it. So we can close all of that out, and now we can test this out. Let's see if this works. Pretty sure it's not going to, because nothing in the world of programming works on the first try. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like. So we'll save this and come back over to our web page. We'll refresh it and we'll type in a username and a password. We'll submit it and we get our error. I will try to debug this error and then let you know what was the problem once I get it figured out. Okay, so surprisingly, this error was really simple to figure out. We'll go ahead and close that. I didn't have a comma right here. So if you go back and look at my code, you'll see that I was missing this comma right here. And that is why nothing ever works the first try. Too many syntax too many syntax problems could possibly take place on the first try. So I was missing this comma, and I went ahead and saved it and sent it over, and you can see that this went through. So let's see if it went through to our database. If you want to try it, you can refresh this page, type something in here, hit submit, it'll hang. You can hit the X right here, come over to your database. You should see your information over here, and let's see if our statement worked. We'll open back up our workbench, and an easy way to check this is come to your table and hit this little button right here, and it will tell us that our user 1 was created. In fact, I'm actually going to delete this guy. So we'll delete this row. And if we come over here, you're often going to see in SQL injection, if you're trying to log in as somebody as the first user and you get SQL injection to work, often the first user is going to be admin and the admin password over here. And if you submit this, we're going to see that our user was created. And we'll stop this from hanging. Open up your workbench and we can refresh it with our little refresh button right here. And we have our admin right here as our first user being created. So we'll apply our changes so that way this guy stays right here. So now we have this all set up and our database is working. So now we can create a user. But what good does it do if we can create a user and we are not able to log in? So we're going to do another function, and bear with me, this is going to be a lot easier the second time we go through, and then the second time we actually create a post request. We'll create our post request right here for our second user. So we have this all right here. What I want to do, this is really bad coding practice, but we're going to do it anyway. We're going to just grab this entire form and we're going to copy it and we're going to paste it, and we are going to change the information rather than retype all of this exact same information. So we're going to go inside this form right here and we're going to make sure we add in a line break so that way it doesn't all show up on the same line. And now inside of our form, we're going to change our ID to a 3. We're going to change this ID to a 4. We're going to make this username 1. We're going to make this password 1. And we're going to change our IDs to ID number 3 and ID number 4. We're going to change our const over here to user 1 and password 1. We're going to change our route to something other than API. We'll just call it login right here, and we'll save this. I believe this looks okay. Let's change this create account to login. The reason you're not supposed to copy paste is because I'm probably going to have an error because I didn't change something that I should have. But we'll debug that when we come to it. So we save that, we'll save our server to reboot it, we'll refresh over here, and now we have this login page. But we need to create a new post over here. And this is one place we are definitely not going to be copying and pasting because our post request, because this is going to be vulnerable code, we're just going to say app.post and we're going to create this from scratch. And if you remember, this is coming from what we called our login form over here. Let's check and make sure we actually changed it. We did not. This right here is now going to say login just like this, and this fetch is going to be login from this login form. So now if we come back over here, we have this login, and we're going to do the same thing we did before, and we're going to say function, we're going to say request and response. We will open up our curly braces, and we're not going to console log this time, but we are going to grab this right here, copy, paste, and instead of user, we're going to grab user 1, and we're going to grab password 1 right here. And now we're going to write our connection to our database. We're going to say connection.query just like before. And now here comes our vulnerable statement. We're going to say select. And this is going to look really familiar to you if you've ever done any kind of SQL injection, which if you're making a resume at this point, you should probably be familiar with some SQL statements. So we're going to select from, and let's see, what did we call our database? We called it SQL injection right here. So we will say select all from SQL injection, and I hope I spelled that right so we don't have to debug anything, where our user, which is going to be our first column, equals, and here comes a syntax nightmare, but you're going to need to get this right. We have a single quote, a double quote. We actually need another double quote over here, just one. And so we're going to tell it we are grabbing the request dot body, and it's going to be this user one right here. So we'll just copy this. I guess we could have used this username, but we're going to go with this so that way you see what we're grabbing. So we're grabbing the request from the body, which is going to be our form over here. And we are going to add in our quotes to close this off. And we want to grab the password to check our password that has been entered from over here. So we're going to say password, and then we're going to do the exact same thing we did right here. The only difference is we're going to change this from user to password. So we have this user and password. We will need a comma right here. Let's check why our app crashes. We have clearly got a syntax error with our quotations. We need another plus right here, and we need a plus to close off this statement right here. So now we have this SQL statement. We're still getting an error, and we're going to finish it here in a second. I think if we close this off, we shouldn't get our error. So we'll get rid of that comma for now, but we have to put it back, remembering we forgot the one up here. But if we come up here, when our user puts in a single quote, so we'll move this up here. If somebody puts in a single quote and this gets sent to our server, if you pump in a single quote right here, you now crash this entire statement, and you can put in whatever you want inside of right here as your user, and it doesn't even have to be a real user. And then you can throw in another single quote which shuts that off, and then you'll say or 1 equals 1, which you should be familiar with, and then you'll throw in your pound sign, which will close everything else off inside the database. So you should be familiar with that SQL statement by now, especially if you're looking to apply to jobs. So now we can add back in our comma. So we have our SQL statement right here. It's all working, and our single quote will throw this all off and crash our server, which we're going to see in a second. So now we can finish writing off our server. So this is going to look really similar to what we had going up here. We're going to put inside of brackets our username, just like this, a comma, password, and actually we need password 1, and we need username 1, and we need to change this right here to password 1 and username 1. I said that backwards, but that's what we need. And we're going to throw in our if statement. And so if we have an error, we want it to do something. So if we have an error, open up our curly braces, we want res.send, and we're going to send over the error that we get. And the syntax for that looks like this. Now, you do not have to worry about memorizing the syntax. Every single time I have to do something like this, I have to look up this syntax. I do not remember it by heart, and I probably never will, because I don't set up enough databases to remember this by heart. You just need to know this is how you do it, and this is how you break it. The syntax is something that I have to look up every single time. So we'll say if we have a result that comes back from the server. So if we get a result from the server that is not an error. So if the username that they enter in over here does not exist, the server is going to send back null, which means nothing. So if we actually get a result, it's going to send back something. And if that something is bigger than 0, which is null, then we actually know that there was a login successful. So we can come over here and we can say that you were logged in. So we'll say res.send. And typically we would send a actual login page. In this case, we're just going to send, instead of sending a file like you're logged in, like a portal, because we're not actually building a login portal. We're just building a simple SQL injection / create a user. We're just going to send back something like you're logged in. So we'll just say logged in, just like this. If it comes back as null, then we're going to actually need an else statement. So we will say else, and we'll open up our else statement, and we'll say res.send, and we're sending a message, and I need to fix the one above. We're sending a message, and the message we're sending is wrong username / password, just like this. And so this actually needs to be res.send, and we're sending a message just like this as well. So I believe our syntax is right, but I could be wrong. So go ahead and try this. It says our database is working. So we created a user, as you can see right here, admin. So we know that admin is a user. So we'll just say admin submit, and we're getting it hanging, which means it did not send our message, which means we have a database syntax error over here that I'm going to have to debug and then let you know where it is. So actually, given the syntax, I think all of this stuff should be purple. So I think we're missing a parenthesis, but I'm not sure which one is not closed off yet. So let me see if I can find it, and then I'll tell you where it was. Okay, I found it, and I found it really quickly. So this our query needs to all be inside of one single quote. So this comma needs to be right here. So we can come down here, and we're gonna need a comma right here. We actually forgot to call our error and our result. So right here, we have another error, and we can say right here, error and result, and we need to call this function. So we can call the function just like we have previously. We'll delete that, and I think it goes right here. So if we save this, our database is working. Come back here, refresh, admin, send, and we get an error. So we actually have our database sending back an error message for us. So, which I'm not sure. Let's try this again. And then let's look at our database message. You have an error in your SQL syntax, and it is inside of this admin. So we'll need to fix this. I think it's right here. I think it's going to end up being our, let's go check out our syntax and see what the error problem is. And this is a really stupid syntax error. So if you look right here, we have the SQL where the username equals admin, and over here and password equals admin. It needs to have an equal sign right here. Hopefully that is the end of our typos. So we can come over here and say admin, still have a syntax error. So let's see if we can figure out where this one's at. Okay, so somehow I accidentally deleted that one on this password one as well. So now we should have everything set up here. So now if we save our database and we come over here and we say admin, we get a message back returned to us in JSON, and it tells us logged in, and our message, I'm not sure why it popped up quite that way, but we have our message and it's telling us we are logged in. If we come up here and we give it some user that does not exist and we say login, we're told username does not exist. So now our login function works. So we can come over here and we can say Tom Bob, and we can create our user, and we'll go ahead and close that. We can say our user Tom and password Bob. If we come back over to our MySQL workbench, we can refresh this right here, and we are told we get Tom and Bob as a user. So we can try that user and say Tom, Bob, log in, and it tells us we are logged in. But what happens if we give it a name that doesn't exist? We can say submit, wrong, username, and password. Now here comes the SQL injection. We can actually come in here and pass it that same SQL injection that we saw earlier. So we know this isn't a user. It's not in our database. Very clearly not in our database. And we can give it some random password over here, but we can also now break this SQL statement because we wrote this vulnerable code right here, and we're able to give it a true statement. So we'll say if this is not true, we can also say or 1 equals 1, and so if 1 equals 1 is true, then it's going to log us in as admin, and so we'll close that off and we will comment everything out after it, which is our password. And if we say submit, we are logged in. Okay, so if we had our website actually set up to send you to a login page in our code over here, we would actually see a login portal at this time rather than just something simple that says logged in. But the reason I wanted to include this inside your portfolio is because if you can create a server and link it to a database and then also make it so that it's secure, where you create a logged in user, and then also made it to where it's vulnerable to SQL injection, it's going to look really good to employers, showing that you really understand the code, you understand how servers work, you understand how APIs can send information. You see that we are sending our information through JSON, and the server is actually able to read it, and we're actually to tell the server to use the body parser, and we want to use the JSON parser so that it can actually understand the JSON, send it to the database, and then authenticate a user. And we can also inject into it because we actually understand how the SQL statements work. If we want to send, say, our variables like this in our secure code, and we want to send it with insecure code. I actually don't think I showed you this. If we come back here and we refresh this page, we can send this in and we can give it single quotes or double quotes, and we can submit this. And then if we come to our database and we refresh our database users, you're actually going to see it submit these users with these quotes because this is written with secure code. And then you can also see how the insecure code works down here, and you can inject into it and you can log in as a different user. And if you want to practice with this, you can actually come over here and you can start by sending injection codes right here and try and pull down the column names and pull down the information schema and pull down the actual users and the passwords. You can practice on this with your SQL injection. So you've actually seen how to set up a front-end portfolio. You have linked it to your GitHub page. So now all you need to do to finish off your resume is create a GitHub page and post on there maybe the tools that we have created that are down in the link below. If you want to create some tools off of my YouTube channel, we have created a API fuzzer, a GitHub scraper, and now you can also post this portfolio website on your GitHub page. And when you submit a resume that doesn't have any college experience or certifications, you can say, I've made these projects, I've set up a server, I have set up a database, I created this portfolio website, I understand nodeJS, Express.js, HTML, and MySQL, and you have created these tools in Python if you've gone through my channel and set those up. And you can also include in your Hack the Box name and whatever else you have accomplished in that resume. So if you have any other projects you would like to cover, please let me know down in the comments below and I'll try to get to those. Thanks for watching.